The first rule in the Ranger logbook was written in thick black marker. Never open the window after 3 a.m. At first, I assumed it was a joke left by bored Rangers. Then, on my first night at Cabin 12, something tapped on the glass. At first, I assumed it was a joke left by bored Rangers. Then, on my first night at Cabin 12, something tapped on the glass. Most new Rangers avoided them. 2 weeks alone in a wooden cabin surrounded by miles of forest doesn't appeal to people who are used to radios, trucks, and coworkers within shouting distance. But after a few seasons on the job, quiet becomes valuable. Out there, the rules are simple. Watch the forest. Record the weather. Keep the radio on. The district map shows the cabins as small dots spread across the state land, each one responsible for a wide stretch of wilderness. Some are close enough to gravel roads that you might hear a truck pass once or twice a day. Others sit much farther out, where the forest grows thick enough to swallow sound. Cabin 12 belonged to the second category. The drive took almost 2 hours after the last paved road ended. The track narrowed as it went, the tires kicking dust into the air behind me. Pines leaned close to the road, tall and quiet. Every few miles there was a metal sign reminding visitors that fires were prohibited and camping was restricted. After a while the forest stopped feeling like a place people visited. It started feeling like a place that existed without them. Cabin 12 stood alone on a low ridge. It was smaller than I expected, a square wooden structure with a narrow porch and one exterior light fixed above the door. The boards were faded from weather, and the roof carried a thin line of old pine needles along its edges. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the smell. Old wood. Cold metal. A faint trace of propane from the heater. The inside of the cabin was simple: a small kitchen counter, a table with 2 chairs, and a narrow bunk room separated by a thin wall. The desk sat directly under the front window, facing the forest. A black radio unit rested on top beside the weather logbook. A fan sat in the corner. It was an old oscillating model with a dent in the front grille. When I plugged it in, the motor hummed softly and the fan began turning side to side, pushing slow circles of cool air across the room. Little details like that matter when you're alone. You start recognizing every sound the building makes. The quiet click of the fan turning. The low hum of the refrigerator. The way the wooden floor shifts slightly when the temperature changes at night. Those sounds become reassuring. They remind you that the cabin is stable. Predictable. Outside the window, the forest stretched out in every direction. During the day it looked ordinary enough. Pine trees. Dirt trails. Dry brush between the trunks. Nothing that suggested the place was different from 100 other ranger districts. But the window changed after sunset. Once darkness settled over the trees, the glass stopped showing the outside world. It turned into a reflection instead, mirroring the inside of the cabin perfectly. The fan, the desk, the radio, and whoever happened to be standing in the room. I finished my equipment checks before the sun dropped below the ridge. Generator fuel was full. Weather station was transmitting. Radio check with dispatch came through weak but clear enough. Everything looked normal. That first evening passed quietly. I heated a can of soup on the small stove and wrote my first entries in the logbook. Wind speed. Temperature. Time of sunset. Routine things. The kind of details that make long nights pass faster. By the time I turned the cabin lights down, the forest outside had gone completely dark. The porch light pushed a soft circle of yellow onto the ground near the steps. But beyond that small patch of dirt the trees were nothing but black shapes. Inside, the fan hummed steadily. The cabin felt warm and contained, like a small island of light sitting in the middle of a much larger darkness. At the time, I remember thinking that the quiet was exactly what I had hoped for. I didn't know yet that Cabin 12 already had its own routine. And that routine usually started a few minutes before 3 in the morning. The first night in a remote cabin is always about learning about the building, not the layout. That part is simple. 1 bedroom, 1 main room, 1 door leading to the porch. You understand the structure in a few minutes. What takes longer is learning the sounds. Every isolated cabin develops its own small language of noise. Rangers depend on that language the same way sailors learn the sounds of a ship. Once you know what belongs there, anything unfamiliar stands out immediately. Cabin 12 spoke quietly. The refrigerator hummed with a steady, almost comforting vibration that you could feel through the wooden floor if you stood close to it. The fan in the corner turned slowly from left to right, the motor producing a low circular whisper as the blades moved through the air. Every time it reached the far side of its swing, the dented grille clicked once before reversing direction. Click. Pause. Click. It wasn't loud enough to bother anyone, but after an hour inside the cabin it became part of the rhythm of the room. The boards in the walls expanded when the evening air cooled down. That sound came as a faint shifting creak somewhere behind the drywall, like a slow breath moving through the structure. The heater occasionally responded with a small metallic tick as the temperature changed. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in long passes. When a stronger gust came down the ridge, the pine needles brushed against each other with a dry whisper that sounded almost like distant rain. The noise rolled across the forest in waves, fading and returning several seconds later. All those sounds had reasons. That was the important part. When you spend enough time alone in the woods, logic becomes a form of comfort. If the refrigerator hums, it means the power is running. If the wind pushes the trees, you know why the branches move. Even the occasional animal crossing through the brush leaves clues to the sound it makes. Everything has a cause. The cabin window added another layer to that quiet routine. During the day, the glass looked out across a slope of trees stretching down into the valley. The dirt road I had driven in on curved away through the forest, disappearing behind a rise about 200 yards from the porch. But once night arrived, the outside world vanished. The window turned black. Without light beyond the glass, it became a mirror reflecting the interior of the cabin with surprising clarity. The desk appeared inside the reflection exactly where it stood in the room. The radio lights blinked softly against the dark background. The fan rotated behind me, its movement repeating perfectly in the glass. It felt strange the first few times I noticed it. You're used to windows showing what's outside. Seeing the room staring back at you takes a moment to adjust. After a while, though, the reflection became useful. I could sit at the table and still see the door behind me in the glass. If something moved near the porch, the change in shadow would appear in the window. Another quiet reassurance. The first hours of the night passed easily. I filled out the logbook entries every 30 minutes the way the procedures required. Temperature dropped slowly after sunset. Wind stayed steady from the west. Routine numbers. Around midnight, the radio crackled briefly with a burst of static before falling silent again. That happens often in remote districts. Signals bounced unpredictably across hills and valleys. I wrote the interference down in the logbook and kept working. By 1 in the morning, the forest outside had grown very still. The wind slowed until the pine branches barely moved. Without that constant brushing sound, the quiet around the cabin deepened in a way that felt heavier than before. Inside, the fan continued its steady rhythm. Click. Pause. Click. The refrigerator hummed. The floorboards settled occasionally beneath my feet. Those familiar noises filled the cabin like a soft mechanical heartbeat. It was sometime after 2 when I realized how completely I had memorized them. Every sound in the room had come up with, which meant when something new appeared, it didn't take long to notice. At first it was so faint that I thought it might have come from inside the walls. A small, dry noise. Tap. I stopped writing and listened. The fan continued turning. The refrigerator hummed steadily. Nothing else moved. I waited a moment, telling myself it had probably been a pine cone falling from the roof or a branch shifting in the wind. Then the sound came again. Tap. This time it was clearer. Not from the roof. Not from the wall. From the window. One more moment passed. Then a third sound followed, spaced exactly like the first 2. Tap. 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 3 light taps against the glass. Evenly spaced. Careful. And close enough that whoever, or whatever, made them had to be standing right outside the cabin. The tapping didn't continue right away. After those 3 soft knocks on the window, the cabin fell back into the same quiet rhythm it had before. The fan clicked once as it reached the end of its swing. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a branch shifted slightly in the still air. For a moment I sat at the table convincing myself that I had imagined it. Isolation does strange things to attention. When you're alone long enough, your brain starts filling silence with meaning. A sound that would go unnoticed in a house full of people suddenly becomes important. I waited another minute. Nothing. Eventually I stood up and walked toward the window. The curtain hanging there was thin, just enough fabric to dull the light from inside the cabin. When I reached out and pulled it aside, the porch light spilled faintly across the ground outside. The dirt was empty. No footprints. No animals moving through the brush. Beyond the reach of the porch light, the forest began immediately, rows of pine trunks standing motionless in the darkness. The wind had died almost completely, leaving the trees frozen in place like tall shadows. I watched the glass for a while longer. Nothing tapped again. After another minute I let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the table. That should have been the end of it. But something about the sound lingered in my head. 3 taps. Evenly spaced. Too careful to be random. I tried to shake the thought away by continuing my routine. Another weather entry in the logbook. Another check of the radio. The small, predictable tasks that keep time moving in isolated places. The clock on the desk turned to 2:59. The cabin felt strangely quiet. The fan turned slowly behind me. Click. Pause. Then something tapped on the window. The kitchen cupboards were narrow and deep, kind built decades ago when cabinets were expected to hold metal pots and canned food rather than appliances. I opened the first door looking for the spare coffee filters stored somewhere near the back. The cupboard smelled faintly of paper and old wood. Inside were a few stacked bowls, a dented metal mug, and a roll of paper towels. When I reached inside to move the bowls aside, my fingers brushed against something taped to the inner wall. A piece of folded paper. I pulled it loose and unfolded it under the kitchen light. It wasn't notebook paper. It looked like a strip torn from a folded map, the edges jagged where someone had ripped it free. The writing was done in thick black marker, the letters pressed hard enough to leave shallow grooves in the paper. Only one sentence was written across the strip. Don't open the window after 3 a.m. Below it, in smaller letters, someone added another line. If you hear tapping, turn on the lights and stay away from the porch. No name. No date. Just the rule. For a moment I stood there reading it again, trying to decide whether it was meant seriously or not. Cabins like these get passed between rangers year after year. Some people leave notes about broken equipment or hidden tools. Others leave jokes to surprise the next person on rotation. At first, I assumed this was the second kind. Still, something about the handwriting didn't feel playful. The letters were neat but pressed hard into the paper. The kind of pressure people use when they want the message to remain clear long after they've gone. I folded the strip once and looked around the kitchen. The cupboard door had a small rectangle of old tape still stuck to the inside where the note had been attached. It had probably hung there for years, which meant whoever wrote it had expected the next ranger to find it exactly the way I had. I turned the paper over in my hand. The back side was blank. No explanation. No reason. Just the rule about the window. Behind me, the fan completed another slow turn. Click. The sound echoed softly through the cabin. I looked toward the dark curtain covering the window. The tapping hadn't returned. But suddenly the quiet outside felt less like ordinary forest silence, and more like something waiting patiently on the other side of the glass. And according to the note in my hand, whatever it usually came back a few minutes after 3. I kept the note. I didn't tape it back inside the cupboard right away. Instead, I folded it once and slid under the edge of the logbook on the desk. It sat there like a quiet reminder while I tried to return to normal routine. The time on the small digital clock beside the radio read 2:41 a.m. 19 minutes before 3. The number stuck in my head more than I wanted to admit. The rule on the paper hadn't said anything before 3. Only after. That detail felt strangely important. I sat at the desk and listened to the cabin again, trying to prove to myself that nothing unusual was happening. The fan continued its steady motion behind me. The refrigerator motor vibrated faintly through the floorboards. Somewhere in the wall a pipe clicked as the heater adjusted to the falling temperature outside. Everything sounded the same as it had been before. I opened the logbook and wrote the current conditions. Wind had dropped almost completely. The temperature outside had fallen several degrees since midnight. Quiet weather. Quiet forest. A few minutes later the radio crackled briefly with static. The sound was sharp enough to make me glance up. No voice followed it. The channel returned to silence. I leaned back in the chair and rubbed my eyes. Cabin rotations make time move strangely. Hours stretch when nothing happens. Then small details begin to feel larger than they should. A branch hitting the roof becomes a possible animal. A distant noise becomes a question. The note on the desk had started doing that to my thoughts. I looked toward the window again. The curtain hung motionless. The glass behind it reflected the room faintly where the light leaked through the fabric. I could see the glow of the desk lamp in the reflection, the edge of the radio unit, and the shadow of the fan moving back and forth behind me. Nothing outside moved. The clock ticked over to 2:57. I told myself that if anything strange happened again, I would simply check the window and settle it. That would end the curiosity quickly. Rules written by bored rangers didn't deserve much respect. Another minute passed. Then another. The clock on the desk turned to 2:59. The cabin felt strangely quiet. The fan turned slowly behind me. Click. Pause. The refrigerator hummed under the counter. Then something tapped on the window. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. The fan turned slowly toward the wall, and then back toward the desk. The refrigerator hummed. The radio light blinked softly beside my elbow. Then the sound came again. Tap. The noise landed clearly against the glass behind the curtain. I didn't move. Tap. The second knock came in the same place. The spacing between them was careful, deliberate, like someone standing outside with their knuckles against the window. My eyes drifted toward the clock again. The numbers changed. 3 a.m. The third tap followed immediately. Tap. 3 knocks. Evenly spaced. My attention moved slowly toward the curtain covering the window. The fabric barely stirred in the still air. The reflection of the desk lamp glowed faintly across it. I remembered the note. Don't open the window after 3. The rule suddenly felt less like a joke and more like advice someone had written after learning something the hard way. The tapping didn't stop. A few seconds passed. Then the pattern repeated. Tap. 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 3 more knocks. Whoever was outside wasn't in a hurry. The rhythm was patient. Calm. Almost polite. I stayed seated. The fan clicked again as it turned toward me, the sound unusually loud in the quiet room. I could hear my own breathing now, shallow and slow. Another set of knocks came against the glass. Tap. 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 The curtain remained closed. I didn't stand up this time. Instead, I reached over and turned the desk lamp brighter, then switched on the overhead light as well. The room was filled with stronger illumination, pushing the corners of the cabin back. The tapping paused for a moment. Then it returned, softer now. 3 slow taps. The sound continued for nearly a minute after that. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped completely. No footsteps. No movement outside. Just the quiet forest pressing against the walls again. I stayed at the desk for a long time after that, staring at the curtain and listening to the fan turn behind me. Eventually, when the sky outside the window began to pale with early morning light, I stood up and walked over to the logbook. I flipped to a fresh line and wrote down the time. Then I added a single sentence beneath the weather report. 3 a.m. Tapping heard at window. Did not respond. Morning light always makes the forest look harmless. When the sun rose over the ridge behind cabin 12, the trees turned from black silhouettes into ordinary pine trunks again. The dirt around the porch looked dry and undisturbed. The same quiet slope I had driven through the day before stretched down toward the narrow road. For a while, the events of the night felt smaller. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and walked slowly around the cabin. The ground near the window where the tapping had come from was covered in loose dust and old pine needles. If someone had stood there, even briefly, they would have left something behind. There were no footprints. No scuffed dirt. No broken branches. Just the same quiet forest floor. I crouched near the wall and examined the window frame itself. The glass was clean except for a faint streak where rain had dried months earlier. No marks. No scratches. Nothing that suggested someone had knocked against it during the night. Eventually I straightened up and told myself the obvious explanation. Branches. Animals. Something small brushing the glass in the wind. The problem was that the wind had barely moved. Back inside the cabin, the fan hummed steadily again. The heater clicked once as the morning temperature warmed the room. All the familiar sounds had returned, restoring the sense of normal routine. I poured the rest of the coffee into my mug and sat down at the desk. The logbook waited for where I had left it the night before. Cabin logs are simple records. Weather readings, patrol notes, equipment checks. Nothing dramatic. Most pages are filled with the kind of writing that becomes boring even to the person recording it. But when I flipped back through the earlier entries, something began to stand out. Several pages back, a ranger named Cole had written a short note in the margin beside a weather report. 3:05 a.m. heard tapping at window again. Ignored it. The handwriting looked rushed, the letters thin and angled. There was no further explanation. I turned to another page. 2 weeks later, another entry appeared, written by someone else. Tapping outside the window at 3 o'clock. Follow the rule. No description of what rule meant. Just the phrase. Follow the rule. I kept turning pages. The pattern repeated every few months. Sometimes a single sentence is tucked beside routine weather data. Sometimes nothing more than the word, tapping, written beside the time. One entry stood out more than the others. The handwriting was heavier, pressed hard into the paper the way someone writes when they want the message to last. Rule 1. Do not open the window after 3 a.m. below it. In smaller writing, if something taps, turn on the lights and stay inside. I leaned back into the chair and looked around the room again. The fan moved slowly across the floorboards. The radio light blinked once. Everything looked the same as it had the night before. Yet the cabin suddenly felt different. The note in the cupboard hadn't been a joke left by a bored ranger. It was part of a pattern. Several different people had experienced the same thing over the years. The tapping had happened often enough that someone eventually decided it needed a rule. I flipped forward again, scanning the most recent entries. 3 rotations before mine, another ranger had written something longer than the others. If you hear tapping and then someone calls your name, do not answer. The sentence ended there. No details about what had happened. No explanation of why that rule existed. Just the warning. I closed the logbook slowly and rested my hand on the cover. Outside the window, the forest looked calm under the morning sun. Pine branches shifted gently as the wind returned. For most of the day I convinced myself that the rules were simply habits that had grown out of boredom and long nights. But when evening arrived again and the sky darkened around the cabin, I noticed something about my routine had already changed. Before turning in for the night, I checked the curtain over the window twice. And when the clock moved closer to 3 in the morning, I found myself sitting at the desk with every light in the cabin already turned on. The second night in a place like that is always quieter than the first. The novelty is gone. The building feels more familiar. Your brain stops questioning every creak in the walls and starts sorting sounds automatically again. By evening, cabin 12 felt almost routine. Still, I noticed something had changed in my habits. Before sunset I checked the porch light. It was a simple metal fixture above the door, protected by a small wire cage to keep branches from striking the bulb. During the day it looked unimportant, barely noticeable against the weathered boards of the cabin. At night, it became the edge of the world. When darkness fell over the ridge, the light pushed out just far enough to illuminate the wooden steps and a narrow patch of dirt surrounding them. Beyond that circle of yellow, the forest turned immediately black. No gradual fading. Just light, then nothing. I stood on the porch for a few minutes that evening, watching the edge where the glow stopped. The dirt road carved down the slope to the right, disappearing into the trees after about 30 yards. To the left, the ground dropped toward a line of thicker brush and fallen logs. Inside the light, everything looked ordinary. Outside it, the forest hid itself completely. That boundary felt sharper than it should have. When I stepped back into the cabin, the familiar sounds greeted me again. The fan rotated slowly in the corner. The refrigerator hummed under the counter. The heater ticked once as the evening air cooled. Comforting sounds. Predictable sounds. I made dinner at the small stove and filled out the logbook entries for sunset conditions. Wind had returned slightly from the west. Temperature dropping steadily again. Routine numbers. By midnight the cabin felt warm and contained. The overhead light glowed softly against the ceiling. The fan moved cool air across the room in steady arcs. Outside the window the forest had disappeared into darkness again, the glass reflecting the room exactly the way it had the night before. The curtain remained closed. I left it that way. Sometime after 1 in the morning, I stepped onto the porch again, mostly out of habit. Rangers do it often during long shifts, checking the horizon, listening for distant engines, watching the trees move in the wind. The porch boards creaked under my weight. The air smelled dry and faintly sweet with pine sap. Somewhere deeper in the forest an owl called once, the sound carrying clearly through the still air. The porch light cast its small circle across the dirt. Beyond it, the trees stood like dark pillars. I leaned against the railing and watched the boundary where the light ended. There was something oddly hypnotic about that line, the way the darkness seemed to begin instantly at its edge. Then a thought returned to me from the logbook entry I had read earlier that morning. Never answer a voice outside the cabin after midnight unless you can see the person clearly in the porch light. At the time, the warning seemed exaggerated. Standing there on the porch, though, the rule made a strange kind of sense. Anyone approaching the cabin would have to pass through the light eventually. The road led directly toward the steps. Even someone walking from the trees would become visible before reaching the porch. Unless they stopped just short of the glow. I stared at the dark line of forest where the light faded. Nothing moved. No footsteps. No branches shifting. Only the quiet of the trees surrounding the cabin. After a while I stepped back inside and closed the door. The fan continued its slow rotation behind me. The radio sat silently on the desk. Everything inside the cabin remained calm. But the idea of that rule lingered in my thoughts longer than I expected. Because somewhere out there, just beyond the reach of the porch light, there was more than enough darkness for someone to stand without being seen. The first time you hear your name outside an isolated cabin, your brain doesn't register it as strange. Not immediately. Human voices are so familiar that they bypass the part of your mind that checks for danger. You hear the sound and assume it belongs somewhere normal. A coworker. A hiker who ignored the posted signs. Someone from the district office arrived earlier than expected. That was my first reaction when it happened. I was sitting at the desk inside cabin 12, filling out the 1:30 weather entry. The fan moved warm air across the room. The logbook pages scratched softly under my pen. Then I heard it. "Mark!" The voice came from outside the cabin. Soft. Familiar. For a moment I thought it was another ranger. Then the voice spoke again. "Mark, open the door." That's when I realized something was wrong. Everyone at the station calls me by my last name. For a second I didn't even look up. I finished writing the wind speed and placed the pen down beside the book. Only then did the thought catch up with the sound. No one should have been out there. The nearest ranger station was nearly 40 miles away. Dispatch would have called ahead if someone was driving up the service road in the middle of the night. I turned slowly into the chair and looked toward the door. The porch light was still on. A faint yellow glow leaked through the edges of the curtain covering the front window. Nothing moved. The voice came again. "Mark, you out there?" It sounded familiar. That was the strange part. For a moment I thought it might be Ellis, another ranger who sometimes covered rotations in nearby districts. The tone matched his voice closely enough to feel convincing. But Ellis should have been working at the Southern Watch Tower that week. And even if he had driven all the way up the ridge to cabin 12, he wouldn't have stopped outside in the dark calling quietly through the wall. He would have knocked on the door. I stayed seated at the desk. The rule from the logbook surfaced again in my memory. Never answer a voice outside the cabin after midnight unless you can see the person clearly in the porch light. The voice spoke again. "Hey, I know you're in there." Still calm. Still familiar. I stood up slowly and walked toward the window beside the door. The curtain hung straight down, blocking my view of the porch. If someone was standing in the light, I would see them the moment I pulled the fabric aside. My hand stopped halfway. Something about the voice had started to feel slightly wrong. Not loud enough to explain why. Just wrong. The tone was steady, but the pacing felt strange. Each sentence came after a longer pause than normal conversation would allow, as if the speaker needed time to decide what to say next. Another silence passed. Then the voice called again. "Mark, open the door." This time it sounded farther away. Not on the porch. Somewhere beyond the edge of the light. I remained where I was. The fan clicked behind me as it reached the end of its swing. The refrigerator hummed quietly under the counter. Outside the window, the voice spoke one last time. "Come outside." The words drifted in from the darkness just beyond the porch light's reach. I didn't answer. I didn't open the curtain. For nearly a full minute the forest remained silent. Then, slowly, the sound of footsteps moved away from the cabin. Dry leaves shifted underweight. Branches brushed lightly against fabric. The noise traveled a few yards into the trees and stopped completely. No vehicle started. No door slammed. Just silence. I stayed inside the cabin for the rest of the night with every light turned on. And sometime later, while sitting at the desk staring at the curtain, I realized something that made the back of my neck tighten. Ellis didn't call me Mark. He always used my last name. I didn't sleep after that. Not really. The bunk was only a few steps from the desk, but the idea of turning the lights off and lying down didn't feel reasonable anymore. Instead, I stayed where I was, sitting at the table with the logbook open in front of me while the fan moved slowly behind my shoulder. The cabin had returned to its normal sounds. The refrigerator hummed. The heater ticked occasionally. Outside the window the forest remained silent. But the quiet felt different now. Less like calm, more like something holding still. Around 4 in the morning, I finally wrote the night's entry in the logbook. The pen paused in my hand before I finished the sentence. 1:37 a.m. voice heard outside cabin calling my name. Did not respond. I closed the book and rested my palm against the cover. For a long time, I stared at the earlier pages again. The rule about answering voices had appeared several times in the older entries, but now I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. Each time the warning appeared, it was written a little differently. One ranger had written, "Do not answer voices outside after midnight." Another had written, "If someone calls you from the trees, stay inside." Then, about halfway down a page written 3 years earlier, someone had added a longer note in the margin. "The voice always sounds like someone you know." I read that line twice. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the letters pressed deep into the page the way people write when they want their message understood clearly. Below it, another sentence had been added later in a different pen. Rule 2, never answer the voice. I leaned back into the chair and looked around the room again. Morning light was beginning to creep through the curtain now, turning the edges of the fabric gray. Outside, the forest was slowly reappearing as shapes instead of darkness. The cabin itself looked the same as it had the day before. Fan in the corner. Radio on the desk. Window reflecting the inside of the room. Nothing out of place. But the rules written in the logbook had started to feel less like stories and more like instructions that had been passed quietly between people who worked there. People who had heard the same things I had. I flipped ahead through the pages again, looking for anything else. Several rotations passed without comment. Weather reports, patrol notes, routine entries. Then another line caught my attention. It had been written in thick pencil instead of ink. If the voice comes back, do not open the door. Below that, the writer had drawn a short line across the page, separating the message from the normal entries. Under the line was a final sentence. It doesn't like porch light. I closed the logbook slowly. Outside the window, the sun had risen enough to illuminate the dirt road again. Birds moved through the branches now, their calls sharp and ordinary in the morning air. The forest looked calm, safe. But I noticed something as I stood up from the table. Without thinking about it, I walked over to the front door and checked the porch light switch. I left it on, even though the sun was already up. Because somewhere in the back of my mind, a quiet part of my thinking had already accepted something I hadn't said out loud yet. Whatever had stood out there in the dark last night had stopped speaking the moment it moved away from the light. And if the voice came back again, I wanted that light waiting for it. Cabin rotations include more than sitting inside watching weather patterns. Every few days you run patrols through the surrounding forest. The purpose is simple: check trails, look for illegal campfires, confirm that the service roads remain clear enough for emergency vehicles. Most patrols are quiet drives or short walks through familiar stretches of trees. 3 days after the voice outside the porch light, my patrol route took me down the ridge road toward a smaller service trail marked on the district map as North XS4. The trail hadn't been used much that season. Pine needles covered most of the dirt track, and thin branches leaned across the path in several places where wind had pushed them down. I parked the truck near the entrance and continued foot with the handheld radio clipped to my jacket. The forest felt normal during the day. Sunlight filtered through the tall pines, leaving shifting patches of brightness across the ground. The air smelled dry and clean. Insects moved through the brush in small bursts of sound. Nothing about the place suggested the strange quiet nights back at Cabin 12. About half a mile into the patrol, the radio crackled unexpectedly. 12, you are reading? The signal was weak, broken by static. I recognized the dispatcher's voice immediately. This is 12, I answered. Go ahead. Another burst of interference followed. The voice came through again, thinner this time. Copy. Checking position of Ranger Dalton. Last contact placed him near your sector. Dalton. The name sounded familiar. He worked rotations in a neighboring district, but occasionally crossed into our area during joint patrols. I looked down at the narrow trail stretching ahead through the trees. Negative visual, I said into the radio. Haven't seen anyone on the road today. The channel went quiet for a moment. Then the dispatcher returned. Last transmission from Dalton came 2 nights ago. Short message. Something about checking movement near Cabin 12 boundary. I stopped walking. The trees around the trail remained still in the warm afternoon air. What kind of movement? I asked. Transmission cut before details, the dispatcher replied. Just the phrase voices in the trees. The radio hissed softly between us. For a moment neither of us spoke. Any updates since? I finally asked. None, the dispatcher said. Signal dropped immediately after. We assumed equipment interference. If you see anything unusual near the trail system, log it. Copy that. The channel closed with a faint pop of static. I stood there a moment longer listening to the quiet forest around me. Voices in the trees. The phrase sounded uncomfortably close to what I had heard outside the cabin. Eventually I continued along the trail. The path curved slowly downhill before leveling out near a dry creek bed. The ground there was softer, holding impressions more easily than the rocky ridge soil near the cabin. That's where I saw the footprints. They were fresh enough that the edges still held shape in the dust. Boot prints. Standard ranger issue. They followed the trail for about 20 yards before leaving the path entirely and heading into the thicker trees on the left side. I crouched beside the track and studied it carefully. The stride length looked normal. Not running. Not stumbling. Just walking. But the direction was wrong. The prints moved straight into the forest, away from any road or patrol route. I followed them a short distance between the trunks. 10 steps. 20. The forest floor became harder there, covered in dry needles that didn't hold clear impressions. After another few yards, the tracks disappeared completely. No signs of turning around. No marks showing where the person had come back to the trail. Just the quiet trees standing in every direction. I stood there listening to the wind move faintly through the branches above me. Then I lifted the radio again. "Dispatch," I said. "I might have found Dalton's last trail." Static answered first. Then the dispatcher's voice returned. "Go ahead." I glanced deeper into the forest where the footprints had vanished. "He walked off the path," I said slowly. "Straight into the trees." The radio crackled softly. "Any sign of where he went?" I looked again at the pine-covered ground. "No," I answered. And for some reason I couldn't explain yet, I felt sudden certainty about the next part. "He didn't come back out. Dispatch told me to mark the location and return to the cabin. Standard procedure. Missing ranger reports move through several layers before search teams get involved, especially in districts where radios cut in and out. They needed coordinates, time, and confirmation that the trail was real. Still, I stayed near the spot longer than necessary. The footprints had been clear when I first saw them. Dalton's boots left deep impressions where the dirt was soft near the creek bed. The pattern matched the standard ranger tread we all used. No sign of running. No drag steps. Just a normal walk into the trees. The strange part was how ordinary it looked. If someone had been chased or injured, the ground would have told the story. Broken branches. Uneven stride. Something disturbed the brush. But the forest there remained almost untouched. Dalton had simply stepped off the trail and continued forward like he had decided to take a quiet walk between the pines. I moved a few yards farther into the woods, scanning the ground again. Nothing. The pine needles formed a thick carpet that swallowed any clear impression after the first 20 feet. Beyond that point the trees stood evenly spaced, their trunks rising straight into the afternoon light. The place felt still. Not quite in a threatening way. Just empty. Eventually I walked back to the trail and marked the area with a strip of orange tape from my patrol pack. The bright plastic fluttered slightly in the wind, the only movement in the clearing. I radioed the coordinates back to dispatch. They confirmed the report and told me to return to cabin 12 until further instructions arrived. A search team might come through the next morning if Dalton didn't check in by then. The drive back up the ridge felt longer than usual. The dirt road twisted through the forest in narrow curves, the truck tires crunching over gravel and dry needles. Sunlight faded gradually as the trees thickened around the higher ground near the cabin. By the time I reached the porch, evening had already begun settling across the valley. The familiar shape of cabin 12 stood against the darkening sky, the porch light already glowing faintly in the growing dusk. Inside, the cabin welcomed me with its usual sounds. The refrigerator hummed. The fan rotated slowly in the corner. The radio unit blinked its steady signal light beside the logbook. Everything looked the same as it had every other night. But I noticed something when I stepped toward the window. The curtain had shifted slightly while I was gone. Only a few inches. Just enough that the glass showed a thin slice of the forest outside. At first, I thought the wind might have moved it through the small gap in the frame. Then I remembered something. Before leaving for patrol that afternoon, I had made a point of pulling the curtain completely closed. I stood there for a moment looking at the narrow opening. The forest beyond the glass had already begun fading into shadow as the sun dropped behind the ridge. Pine branches moved slowly in the wind. Nothing else stirred. I reached out and pulled the curtain shut again. The fabric fell straight against the window, sealing the reflection of the room back into the glass. Behind me the fan clicked softly as it turned. The cabin felt warm and contained again. But the thought returned while I filled out the patrol report in the logbook. Dalton had walked calmly into the trees. The last thing he told dispatch over the radio was that he heard voices out there. And somewhere deeper in the forest surrounding Cabin 12, the trail he left behind had simply stopped. After Dalton's trail ended in the trees, the forest around Cabin 12 began feeling slightly different. Not dangerous exactly, just attentive. The search team arrived the next morning, 2 trucks coming slowly up the ridge road in a cloud of dust. They checked the creek bed, followed the trail I had marked, and spread out into the surrounding woods for most of the afternoon. By sunset they returned empty-handed. The explanation they offered was practical. Rangers sometimes wander off trail chasing smoke reports or checking wildlife movement. Dalton might have taken a shortcut toward another service road and lost radio contact in the valleys. It was possible. Still, when the trucks disappeared down the ridge again and the cabin returned to its quiet routine, the silence outside felt heavier than before. Night settled quickly. Inside the cabin the same familiar sounds continued. The fan turned in its slow rhythm. The refrigerator hummed beneath the counter. The radio light blinked softly beside the logbook. Comforting sounds. Predictable sounds. I sat at the desk under the window filling out the evening weather entry. The curtain remained drawn the way it had been every night since the tapping started. But after a while I noticed something odd. The glass beside the curtain reflected the room more clearly than usual. A thin gap had formed where the fabric didn't quite cover the corner of the window. Through that narrow strip, the dark glass worked like a mirror again. I could see the desk. The radio. The fan was moving slowly behind me. The reflection showed the room almost perfectly. Almost. At first the difference was small enough that I thought my eyes were tired. When I reached forward to adjusting the logbook, my reflection in the glass followed the movement. But not at the same time. The motion lagged. Only by a fraction of a second. I froze. The reflection stopped moving too. I sat there staring at the glass for several long seconds before testing it again. Slowly, carefully, I lifted my hand. The reflection copied the motion. But again there was a delay. A tiny pause between the moment my fingers rose and the moment the reflection repeated the action. It was subtle. Easy to miss if you aren't looking for it. I leaned closer to the window. The reflection leaned closer too. Half a heartbeat later. My eyes drifted toward the dark forest visible through the thin gap beside the curtain. Nothing moved out there. Only trees and shadow. When I leaned back in the chair, the reflection followed again with that same faint hesitation. It reminded me of watching a weak video signal where the image trails slightly behind the motion. I sat there for several minutes repeating small movements. Raise my hand. Lower it. Turn my head. Every time the reflection copied me with the same slight delay. Finally, I reached forward and pulled the curtain completely closed again. The mirror vanished. Only the soft glow of the cabin lights remained in the room. Behind me the fan clicked as it turned. The refrigerator hummed steadily. Everything sounded normal. Yet the memory of that tiny delay stayed with me long after I closed the curtain. Because reflections aren't supposed to think about what they're copying. They're supposed to move at the exact same moment you do. And for the first time since arriving at Cabin 12, I had the quiet, uncomfortable feeling that something inside that glass had been watching me long enough to start learning the timing. I kept the curtain closed after that. It felt like the simplest solution. If the glass couldn't reflect the room, then there was nothing there to notice the delay. The cabin returned to the same contained space it had been during the first nights. Walls, fan, desk, radio, logbook. Safe objects. Predictable things. Still, once you notice something like that, your mind keeps returning to it. The rest of that evening passed quietly. I cooked a small meal on the stove, wrote down the routine weather numbers, and checked the radio channel every half hour the way the handbook requires. Nothing unusual came through. But sometime after midnight I realized I had begun glancing toward the window without meaning to. Just quick looks. Checking the curtain. Making sure it hadn't shifted again. Each time the fabric hung exactly where I had left it. Around 1:30 the cabin grew unusually still. The wind outside dropped away again, leaving the trees motionless. Without that constant brushing sound in the branches, the quiet pressed closer to the walls. Inside, the fan kept moving. Click. Pause. Click. I stood up to stretch my legs and walked slowly across the room. The floorboards gave their familiar creak beneath my weight. Halfway to the kitchen counter, I noticed something in the corner of my eye. Movement. From the window. I stopped. The curtain hadn't moved, but the thin strip of uncovered glass near the edge had returned. Just a narrow opening where the fabric no longer touched the frame. I was certain I had closed it completely earlier. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. The reflection returned with it. The desk appeared first in the glass. Then the radio lights. The fan was turning behind my shoulder. Finally, my own figure standing in the center of the room. For a moment, everything looked normal. Then the reflection moved. Not with me. On its own. The image in the glass tilted its head slightly to the side. I hadn't moved. The motion was small, almost curious. Like someone studying a shape from a different angle. My stomach tightened. The reflection straightened again. Now it matched my posture perfectly. Standing still in the center of the cabin. Watching. For several long seconds neither of us moved. Then I lifted my hand slowly. The reflection followed. This time there was no delay. The timing was exact. Too exact. As if whatever had been learning my movements earlier had finally practiced enough to get it right. The fan continued its steady rotation behind me. Click. Pause. Click. I could hear my breathing in the quiet room. The reflection remained still. My reflection stood in the window exactly where it should have been. For a moment it copied every movement. Then it stopped. I was still breathing hard in the middle of the room. But the reflection slowly tilted its head, studying me. And then it smiled. The motion was subtle. Just a small change in the corners of its mouth. But I hadn't changed my expression. My face remained completely neutral. In the glass, the other version of me looked quietly pleased. I didn't watch any longer. I stepped forward and pulled the curtain hard across the window until the fabric covered every inch of glass. The reflection vanished immediately. Only the soft yellow light of the cabin remained. For a while I stood there listening to the fan and the refrigerator humming together. Eventually I walked back to the desk and opened the logbook. My hand hesitated over the page before writing. Then I added a single line beneath the previous entry. Reflection moved before I did. I didn't sleep that night either. After writing the logbook entry, I left the curtain closed and kept the cabin lights on. The fan continued its slow sweep across the room, pushing warm air past the desk and back again. The familiar rhythm helped steady my thoughts. Outside the cabin the forest remained completely still. Around 2 a.m, I turned the radio volume slightly higher. Dispatch usually ran quiet during late hours, but hearing occasional static or distant voices helped break the sense of isolation. For a while nothing happened. The signal stayed silent except for the low hiss of background interference. I sat at the desk flipping through older pages of the logbook again, noticing how many strange notes had appeared during the same hours of the night. Most of them happened between midnight and 3. At exactly 2:46 a.m., the radio suddenly came alive. Statically burst through the speaker, loud enough to make me jump in my chair. The noise lasted several seconds before thinning into something more structured. A voice. Weak. Broken by interference. Any unit copy this is lookout 4. I leaned forward immediately. Lookout 4 was the fire watch tower several miles north of cabin 12. Rangers occasionally rotated there during high fire risk periods. Lookout 4, this is cabin 12, I answered into the microphone. Signal is weak. Repeat transmission. The radio crackled again. I can't see them clearly. They move between the trees. The voice sounded strained, as if the speaker was trying to stay calm while describing something difficult to explain. Who is this? I asked. Another burst of static rolled through the channel. Then the reply came back. Dalton. The name made my hand tighten around the microphone. Dalton had been missing for 3 days. The search team had already assumed he had wandered too far off patrol or lost contact somewhere deeper in the forest. Yet the voice coming through the radio carried the same call sign I had heard during earlier district communications. "This is Cabin 12," I said again. "Dalton confirms your location." Several seconds passed before the radio answered. "Tower, they are climbing the hill." The signal faded briefly before returning. I thought they were trees at first. I stood up slowly from the chair. The radio speaker crackled with heavy interference now, the words fading in and out of the static. "They keep standing just outside the light. The porch light." The phrase from the logbook returned instantly to my mind. "It doesn't like porch light." "Dalton," I said firmly into the microphone, describing what you're seeing. For a moment the transmission almost cleared. His voice came through stronger than before. "This is Lookout 4. The radio crackled. "I can see them in the trees." Static swallowed the signal for a moment. Then his voice returned. "I thought they were shadows, but they're moving." Another pause. "They're standing just outside the light." The signal dropped again. "Faces moving in the dark, can't see their eyes." A long burst of static followed. Then Dalton's voice returned one final time. Quieter now. Almost a whisper. "They start to tap on the glass." The radio went silent. No static. No signal. Just the soft hum of the fan behind me and the distant sound of wind returning to the trees outside the cabin. I kept the microphone in my hand for nearly a minute. "Dalton," I said, "finally respond if you can." The radio didn't answer. But somewhere inside the cabin, just faint enough that I almost missed it, another sound appeared. 3 soft taps against the window behind the curtain. I didn't move right away. The 3 taps against the window were soft, careful, exactly like the first night. For a few seconds I kept my hand on the radio microphone, waiting to see if Dalton's voice would return through the static. It didn't. The cabin stayed quiet except for the fan and the refrigerator humming under the counter. Another set of knocks followed. Slow. Patient. Coming from the same spot behind the curtain. My eyes moved toward the window, but I stayed where I was. The rule written in the logbook repeated itself clearly in my mind. Do not open the window after 3. I looked at the clock beside the radio. 2:58 a.m. The tapping came again. The rhythm was steady enough to feel intentional, like someone standing outside who expected a response. But whoever was there didn't try the door. They didn't walk across the porch boards. They only tapped on the glass. I kept the cabin lights on and remained at the desk until the sky outside the curtain began to lighten with early morning gray. The tapping stopped a few minutes after 3, just as it had the night before. When daylight arrived, the forest returned to its normal appearance. Birds moved through the branches. Wind stirred the pine needles across the dirt road. The ridge looked like any other stretch of state forest. But Dalton's transmission stayed in my head. Lookout 4. The tower stood about 4 miles north of Cabin 12 on the far side of the ridge. Normally it took 15 minutes to reach by truck. I finished the morning log entry, grabbed the radio unit, and drove up the narrow service road that led toward the tower. The forest grew denser the farther I went. Tall pines crowded the road, their branches blocking much of the sunlight. Dust from the truck tires drifted slowly behind me as I climbed the last hill toward the lookout. The tower appeared suddenly between the trees. A narrow metal structure rising above the forest canopy, its small glass cabin perched at the top like a box of windows looking out in every direction. The access ladder hung down the side exactly where it should be. But something felt wrong before I even stepped out of the truck. The tower door at ground level was open. It swung slightly in the breeze, creaking against the metal frame. I approached slowly. Inside the small ground shed, the radio equipment still hummed with power. Maps hung on the walls. A thermos sat on the table beside a clipboard filled with weather readings. Everything looked recently used. But there was no sign of Dalton. I climbed the ladder to the top of the tower. Each rung echoed faintly under my boots as the forest dropped farther below me. By the time I reached the lookout cabin, the entire valley stretched out beneath the structure. The door to the lookout room stood open as well. Inside, the equipment looked untouched. The main radio unit blinked quietly. A pair of binoculars rested on the window ledge facing the northern hills. The logbook lay open on the desk. I stepped inside and read the last line Dalton had written. 2:43 a.m. movement in the trees near the tower. Hard to see clearly. Below the sentence, the pen line dragged sharply across the page, as if he had been interrupted before finishing. I looked out through the tower windows. From that height you could see the forest stretching for miles in every direction. Pine ridges rolled across the landscape like waves of green. Nothing moved anywhere below. No figures. No shapes standing in the trees. The forest looked calm. But as I turned back toward the desk, something else caught my attention. The glass windows surrounding the lookout room reflected the inside of the tower clearly. Desk. Radio. My own figure standing near the door. For a moment the reflections appeared completely normal. Then, slowly, the one behind me raised its hand. I left the tower faster than I climbed it. The moment the reflection moved on its own, something inside me made the decision automatically. I stepped backward out of the lookout room, pulled the door shut, and started down the metal ladder without looking back at the windows. The rungs rang softly under my boots as I descended. Below me the forest remained quiet, sunlight drifting through the branches in thin moving lines. Nothing on the ground suggested anything unusual had happened up there. But I didn't stop moving until my feet touched the dirt again. I checked the tower once more from the ground. The windows at the top reflected the bright sky now. From that distance there was no way to see inside the lookout room clearly. The structure stood still above the trees, exactly the way it should. Dalton wasn't there. I drove back to cabin 12 with the radio volume turned higher than usual. Dispatch answered my call immediately when I reported what I had found. The empty tower. Dalton's unfinished log entry. The equipment still running. They told me to remain at the cabin until another team arrived later that afternoon. The search area would expand north of the ridge once additional personnel reached the district. By evening the forest had grown quiet again. The search trucks came and went. Radios crackled briefly across the valley as teams coordinated routes through the trails. Eventually the engines faded away down the road, leaving cabin 12 alone once more. Night settled in slowly. Inside the cabin the familiar sounds returned to their usual rhythm. The fan turned in the corner. The refrigerator hummed. The porch light cast its steady circle across the dirt outside the door. I sat at the desk finishing the last weather entry of the day when the first knock came. It wasn't on the window this time. It came from the front door. A single, careful knock. I looked up immediately. The cabin stayed quiet. No footsteps crossed the porch boards. No voices followed the sound. Just the fan turning behind me and the faint creak of the building settling in the cool night air. Then the knock came again. Two this time. Soft. Measured. Someone standing on the other side of the door. My eyes moved toward the clock beside the radio. 12:17 a.m. Earlier than the tapping usually started. I stayed in my chair and waited. Another knock followed. 3 slow strikes against the wood. The rule from the logbook surfaced again in my memory. Never answer the voice. But the door hadn't spoken. It had only knocked. I stood up slowly and walked toward it. The porch light was still on. Anyone standing outside should have been visible through the small window set into the upper half of the door. I stopped a few steps away. The glass showed only the empty porch. No movement. No shadow crossing the boards. Still, the sound had been clear. Someone had knocked. I moved closer until my hand hovered just inches from the handle. The cabin felt very quiet now. Fan. Refrigerator. My own breathing. Nothing else. Then the knock came again. But this time it wasn't outside. It came from the inside surface of the door. 3 taps. Right where my hand was resting. My hand pulled back from the handle immediately. The 3 taps had come from the wood itself, not from the porch. I was close enough to feel the faint vibration through the door when it happened. For several seconds I stood there without moving. The porch light still shone through the small window at the top of the door, casting a dull yellow square across the floor behind me. Outside, the porch boards remained empty. No footsteps. No shadows shifting across the light. Just the quiet forest beyond the railing. I stepped back slowly toward the desk. The cabin felt smaller now. The fan continued its slow sweep, pushing air across the room with its steady mechanical whisper. The refrigerator hummed beneath the counter. Normal sounds. Comforting sounds. But the door stood between me and the porch like something that had changed shape while I wasn't looking. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the tapping returned. Tap. 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 3 knocks again. This time they came from the other side. The sound traveled clearly through the wood as if someone had stepped back onto the porch and knocked politely from outside again. I looked the window and the door. Still empty. The porch light revealed the same small square of ground and railing. No one stood there. The knocking came again. 3 more taps. Even spacing. Patient. I stayed where I was. The rules written in the logbook had grown too familiar now to ignore. Every warning pointed to the same idea. Do not answer. Do not open. The cabin grew quiet again for nearly a minute. I thought it might be over. Then the handle moved. Not quickly. Just a slow downward shift in the metal level, as if someone on the outside had gently tested it. The latch clicked once. The door moved inward about half an inch before stopping against the lock. My breath caught in my throat. The porch remained empty through the window. But the door was pushing inward. The pressure lasted only a second. Then it was released. The handle returned slowly to its original position. No further movement followed. The fan clicked behind me as it reached the end of its swing. Outside, the wind moved faintly through the pine branches. After a long time, I walked forward and checked the deadbolt. It was still locked. I slid the chain latch across the frame as well, tightening every lock the door had. The wood felt cold under my palm. For the rest of the night nothing else touched the door. But sometime around 3 in the morning, while sitting at the desk staring at the logbook, I noticed something that made the room feel colder than the forest outside. On the inside surface of the door, exactly where the tapping had happened earlier, 3 faint marks had appeared in the wood. Not scratches. Not dents. They looked more like small circular impressions. As if someone had pressed their fingertips into the surface from the other side. And somehow reached all the way through. The district supervisors decided to end my rotation early. Search teams spent 2 more days combing the forest around the ridge after Dalton disappeared, but they found nothing beyond the footprints I had reported near the creek bed. No gear, no tracks leading farther into the hills, no radio signal anywhere within range. Eventually the official explanation became the simplest one. Lost ranger. Accidental disappearance somewhere deeper in the woods. When the order came through the radio telling me to return to the main station, I didn't argue. The morning I packed the truck, cabin 12 looked the same as it had the day I arrived. The porch boards creaked in the same places. The fan inside the room turned slowly in the corner. The refrigerator hummed with its steady mechanical vibration. Normal sounds. Predictable sounds. The kind that make a place feel stable. I folded my blankets, wiped the kitchen counter, and stacked the equipment exactly where the next ranger would expect to find it. The logbook sat on the desk beneath the window, its pages filled with the weather reports and patrol notes of the past several weeks. Before leaving, I opened it one last time. The page I had written the night before still showed the same sentence. 3 marks appeared in the door. I added 1 more entry beneath it. Rotation ending early. Cabin secure. Equipment operational. Then I paused for a moment before writing the final line. If tapping begins after 3 in the morning, keep every light on and stay away from the window. The pen rested there for a second before I closed the cover. I didn't remove the older warnings written by the rangers before me. The rules remained scattered throughout the pages just as I had found them, small sentences tucked between weather readings and routine notes. Quiet instructions passed from one shift to the next. Outside, the forest looked calm in the morning light. Wind moved gently through the pine branches along the ridge. Sunlight spread across the dirt road that led down toward the main highway. I stepped onto the porch and locked the door behind me. The porch light remained on. For a moment I considered switching it off before leaving. Then I remembered the logbook entry about the tower. They keep standing just outside the light. I left it glowing above the door. The truck engine started easily, its sound echoing softly between the trees as I drove down the narrow road away from the cabin. The forest slowly thinned as the miles passed, the tall pines giving way to shorter brush and eventually open stretches of gravel road. By the time I reached the paved highway again, the radio signal had returned to full strength. Traffic reports, weather updates, ordinary voices. The kind of noise that belongs to the rest of the world. Yet as the cabin disappeared somewhere behind the trees, one thought followed me down the road. All the strange things at Cabin 12 had rules attached to them. And every rule had worked so far. Which meant someone, at some point, had learned those rules the hard way. The first week back in town felt strange. After spending that long in the forest, ordinary noise takes time to adjust to. Cars passing outside the apartment at night sounded too loud. Streetlights pushed yellow pools of light across the pavement. Even the refrigerator in my kitchen seemed to hum with more energy than the quiet one back at the cabin. Still, the routine helped. Morning coffee. Short shifts at the district office. Paperwork that had nothing to do with empty towers or voices in the trees. Most nights I slept normally again. But sometimes, when the apartment was quiet and the lights were low, I noticed myself listening for things that didn't belong there. 3 taps on glass. Footsteps just outside a door. A voice calling from somewhere it shouldn't. Nothing like that ever happened. At least not at first. The first real reminder came late one evening about a week after I returned. I had just finished washing the dishes and turned off the kitchen light. The living room remained dim except for the glow of the television across the apartment. When I stepped toward the hallway mirror, I caught my reflection in the glass. For a moment, everything looked normal. The small apartment behind me. The open kitchen doorway. My own figure standing there in the quiet room. Then I moved. The reflection followed. But not immediately. Just like the cabin window, the motion came a fraction of a second later. The delay was small. Easy to miss if you weren't watching carefully. I froze. The reflection froze too. My chest tightened as I remembered the moment in Cabin 12 when the glass had done the same thing. When something inside it had started learning how to match my movements. Slowly I raised my hand. The reflection copied the motion. Perfect timing. No delay this time. Exactly the same. For several seconds I stood there staring at the mirror. The apartment remained silent around me. Streetlights outside cast soft shapes across the wall. A car passed somewhere down the road, its tires whispering against the pavement. Normal sounds. Normal life. Eventually I stepped away from the mirror and turned off the television. I told myself the delay had probably been nothing more than tired eyes adjusting to the low light. That explanation worked well enough for the rest of the evening. But before going to bed, I walked through the apartment and checked something without thinking about it. Every window, every door, and every reflective surface. Just in case. Because one detail from the logbook kept repeating in my mind as I moved through the quiet rooms. If the reflection moves before you do, leave the room immediately. So far, the mirror in my apartment hadn't done that. But the thought remained there quietly while I turned out the lights. Cabin 12 was nearly 50 miles away now. Yet the rules written in that logbook had followed me home. The tapping came back 3 weeks later. By then the cabin felt far away. Work at the district office had returned to normal rhythm. Reports, supply checks, routine radio traffic. The search for Dalton had officially ended after 10 days with no results. People stopped mentioning it. Forests are large enough to swallow explanations. That night I had fallen asleep on the couch with the television still running. The low glow from the screen filled the living room with shifting blue light. Outside my apartment window the streetlights painted long shadows across the pavement. I woke up slowly, the way people do when something small interrupts their sleep. At first I thought it was the refrigerator cycling on. Then I heard it again. The sound came from the living room window. I didn't sit up right away. My eyes drifted toward the digital clock on the cable box. 3:02 a.m. The second tap followed. Careful. My body went completely still on the couch. For a moment I told myself it could be a branch from the tree outside the building brushing against the glass. The wind sometimes pushed those branches close enough to touch the window. But the air outside was calm. The streetlight beyond the glass revealed an empty sidewalk and the parked cars along the curb. Then the third tap came. 3 knocks. Even spacing. The exact same rhythm I had heard in cabin 12. I didn't move. The television continued its quiet glow across the room. Somewhere down the street a car passed slowly, its tires whispering across the pavement. Nothing stood outside the window. Yet the tapping returned. Another set. My eyes shifted slowly toward the reflection in the glass. Because of the television light, the window showed the living room clearly: couch, coffee table, doorway to the kitchen, and my own figure lying motionless on the couch. For a few seconds the reflection looked normal. Then the one in the glass sat up. I hadn't moved. My reflection leaned forward slowly, placing its hands on its knees exactly the way I would if I were getting up. The motion happened silently inside the window. The tapping outside the glass stopped at the same moment. The reflection turned its head toward me. I kept lying still. The television flickered softly against the walls. In the glass, the other version of me smiled the same quiet smile I had seen back in the cabin. Then it raised its hand and tapped gently against the inside of the window. 3 times. I didn't sit up. Every instinct in my body wanted to move. I wanted to jump from the couch, turn on every light in the apartment, and pull the curtain across the window the way I had done back at the cabin. But the rules from the logbook returned to me all at once, clear and steady in my mind. Do not answer the tapping. Do not open the window. If the reflection moves before you do, leave the room. The thing inside the glass was still smiling. It sat on the couch exactly where I was lying, relaxed and patient, as if it had been waiting a long time for this moment. The light from the television flickered across its face the same way it flickered across the walls of the room. Everything about it looked correct at first glance. Except the breathing. Too slow. Too steady. Outside the window, the streetlight showed an empty sidewalk and the quiet line of parked cars along the curb. Nothing stood there tapping on the glass anymore. Because the tapping had moved to the inside. The reflection lifted its hand again and touched the window. 3 slow knocks from the other side of the glass. I forced myself to move carefully. Not suddenly. Not in a way that looked like panic. Slowly, I swung my feet off the couch and stood up. The reflection didn't follow. It remained seated, still smiling, still watching me from the window. That was enough. I turned away from the glass and walked calmly toward the hallway. The television continued its quiet flicker behind me. The tapping didn't follow this time, but I could feel the reflection watching as I left the living room. I stepped into the bedroom and closed the door gently behind me. The rule had been clear about the next part. Leave the room immediately. Do not look back. I sat on the edge of the bed and listened. The apartment stayed quiet. No footsteps. No tapping. Just the distant sound of traffic moving somewhere outside the building. Eventually the television in the living room turned itself off when the program ended, and darkness settled through the apartment. Morning light arrived a few hours later. When I finally opened the bedroom door and walked back into the living room, the window looked completely normal again. The reflection moved exactly when I did. Nothing smiled. Nothing tapped. But before leaving for work that morning, I noticed something on the inside of the glass. 3 faint circular marks. Not scratches. Not cracks. Just small impressions spaced evenly apart. As if someone had pressed their fingertips against the window from the other side. I wiped them away before leaving the apartment. Still, one thought has stayed with me since that night. Every strange thing connected to cabin 12 came with rules. The rules work. Everything that happened at cabin 12 came with rules. Never open the window. Never answer the voice. If the reflection moves before you do, leave the room. So far those rules have kept me alive. But there's one thing the logbook never explained. No one ever wrote down what happens when the thing in the glass finally learns how to leave.